coming up in this episode.
I think both of them had the interest to not have a strong Muslim country on the Balkan. The Balkans are the backbone of the Ottoman Empire.
Yugoslavia is this collection. It was a kingdom at the time. The Yugoslavia one was a kingdom of Slovenes, Croats, Bosnians, Serbs, some of the South Balkan nations, as we all know. Macedonia was also part of it.
But they weren't the most practicing of people. They would intermarry. You couldn't tell the difference between a Muslim and a non-Muslim. But maybe what's the reasons behind that?
I think there's some truth to that. I think we should not shy away from the fact that Kosovo, Albania, or the Balkans in general. I think one is there is the historical aspect, which the Ottomans, when they were in these lands, they needed really two things. They needed men to fight wars, they needed money and land, right?
I want to start by praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and beginning in His name and sending salutations and salams upon the best of creation, Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, as-salatu was-salam ala rasulillah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Just before we begin, I want to give some production credits and general acknowledgement. First and foremost to my good brother Ilyas Mayo from Vocal Tunes, who provided me with vocal-only background tunes throughout the whole of this production. Second credit goes to Khalifa Visuals, who's helped me out on this journey and who has been kind enough to share equipment with me throughout the last 10 years. And a big shout out and Jazakallah khair to Abu Musa Raps, who provided me with the mic that I'm currently using. And a big thank you to my family, particularly my father, who's the one that opened the door to my interest when it comes to these stories. As a young child, he would take me on different trips and he would always explain to me about my history and about my identity. There's so many other people to thank, and I'm sure you know who you are, and big Jazakallah khair from the bottom of my heart. In this series, I want to uncover for you the untold stories of the Bosnian War through personal accounts of people who lived it and the reflections of analysts who've spent years studying the region. Many of us don't realize that the largest massacre in Europe since World War II took place in the 90s in Bosnia, and it was carried out against Muslims. And yet somehow this part of our history remains largely unknown. But the story of Bosnia isn't just the story of the Balkan Muslims. It's a chapter in the shared history of the Ummah, whether you're from Europe, the Middle East, North or East Africa, the subcontinent or beyond. The aim of this project is to create a lasting record, a contribution to the Ummah's historical library, a series that not only explores the background and the brutality of the war in the 90s, but also highlights some of the untold stories from British Muslims who went there and who were involved as aid workers or fighters. Some of the stories of these men who gave their life for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in defending the Muslims remain unknown, but they are known and they are famous stories with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a better gathering. Whilst we have some of those people alive today, it's important to try and get some of their accounts so we can understand what actually took place. Ultimately, this is about connecting us to our identity through the past, and so we can learn the lessons and we can build a stronger future and a better future for the Ummah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept this effort and make it beneficial, and I hope you can stay with me throughout this journey to the end. Let's begin episode 1. So in this episode, I sat down with someone I found on Instagram. Initially, I was very impressed by his work. He goes by the name of Haristry. He's a young historian and currently he works as a journalist. He's basically what you can call the biggest enthusiast when it comes to Bosnia online today. This episode explores the background into the war and the history of the Muslims of the Balkan region. I also managed to speak to 2 Balkan Muslims who are both political analysts and regularly comment on the region. One being a friend from Germany who I had no intention of interviewing until we got into a discussion. And the second is an analyst whose story we would hear more of in the next episode, but we'll get some of his thoughts on the background today. Anyhow, let's begin.
I don't know if it's too loud, too quiet, and the headphones are messing up my hair. And my hair's nice today.
Just today.
But khair, content is content as long as they can hear us, inshallah. And I've met a brother who I have intended to be one of the main interviews for this. I haven't even got a name for it, but when it comes out, I'll have a name for this series on this new audio project. So the brother that I'm with today, you might have seen him on Instagram. He's making Bosnia famous again, putting it back on the map. And his name is Haristry. So it's Harristory. Haristry. Make sure you check out his page, inshallah. I'm going to be asking him some questions and we're going to try and get into the history in terms of Bosnia and what happened in the 90s. Maybe there's more of a backdrop that we need to understand. maybe there's a backdrop to you that we need to understand. Maybe you can just tell us about why you went there. What was the reason? And like I came across you because of it, and I think your page blew up because of it. Maybe just tell us a bit about yourself and how old you are and where you hail from. Bismillah, the mic's yours.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Okay, so as brothers mentioned, my name is Harris. I am 21 years old. I can class myself as a videographer, a filmmaker, a journalist. I wear too many caps, and also a historian. I recently graduated from the University of Lancaster with a bachelor's degree in history, alhamdulillah. So yeah, there's so many things to unpack when it comes to Bosnia and the Balkans. The first thing is, Balkan history is often called quantum Balkan theory. It's so complex that no matter how long you spend studying and trying to engross yourself in the history of everything, you can never fully understand it. But nevertheless, like you said, we can try to really pinpoint how and what exactly happened for Bosnia, this European country. Like, you know, it held the Winter Olympics in 1984. It was a very famous, actually, it was a popular tourist destination. Like, my parents would say that they knew a lot of people that went to Bosnia back in the days. It used to be part of Yugoslavia as a tourist destination. How did this go from that very multicultural place to literally like the inferno that we saw in the 1990s? So really that's what I hope to try to convey. I guess a little bit about myself and the work I do. I really focus on modern history, and it might surprise people. Usually when people think of history, they think of like the Romans and the Byzantines. They don't usually think of something which literally happened 28 years ago or 29 years ago, almost 30 years. The anniversary is almost, it's creeping up. The war started in 1992, and it's been 30 years, almost 30 years since that happened. And it's not a long time. Like our parents, for example, like were living in that time. They heard the news live. They saw what was happening live. And as I hope you're going to discover more in the next coming interviews, people actually went there that we know.
Yeah.
So it's really something that really hits home. And it's also something that's so recent. And it's so...
It's very recent, but at the same time, I feel like the generations now that are coming don't know about it or they never heard about it.
Absolutely. And I think that's really what my work is, because we have people from that time. We have survivors. We literally have first-hand witnesses that I've personally interviewed that were lined up in firing squads and they were shot. Mothers who were, abused and sexually abused in horrible ways. We have them people alive. And the fact that I've never watched a video of somebody like that being interviewed in the English language is a huge disadvantage for the Muslim Ummah, because we're allowing that history, them lives and their souls to be killed in vain. The story of Bosnia is a really interesting one, because they are Caucasian. They speak the same language as the Serbs and the Croat perpetrators. They probably have the same food, the same culture. But when it came to like the last thing, which was Islam, their religion, that is what distinguished them. And that is what made them different.
I think a good place to start then is, how did Islam come into that region, and how comes it stayed in that region, considering it didn't stay in the surrounding areas? It didn't last as long as it has as in Bosnia.
Excellent question. Yeah, so the Ottomans during the 1300s, they're beginning to expand into Europe. So they haven't taken Constantinople yet, but Sultan Orhan and Sultan Burhan, these are the grandsons and the great-grandsons of the famous Ertugrul Ghazi, as we all know. These two sultans, they specifically had a passion and a dream to establish the Khilafah in Europe, which had only been done, you could say, maybe in Spain, which was a couple hundred years ago before that. So they really had this ambition to not only just, establish a Khilafah, but make sure that when they left, because obviously empires, they rise and fall, and when they leave, that religion and Islam would remain. But they had a main main adversary in the region. You probably know who they are, the Serbs. So the Serbs, since almost 500 years, had been the enemies, you could say, the main adversaries against the Ottomans, especially in the southern Balkans. So they had a massive kingdom. That kingdom stretched across parts of Kosovo, today Kosovo, I think parts of Albania, Bosnia, but nevertheless they were like the bulwark. They were what stood in the tracks of the Ottomans and, of course, literally Europe. Had it not been for the Serbs, the Ottomans would have steamrolled through them completely all the way to like maybe France, Western Europe. So the Serbs really held off. But there was a pivotal date, there was a pivotal battle, and it's really important to know in the context of the Bosnian War, for example, which is so strange because this event happened 700 years ago, but it's still so relevant today. That was the Battle of Kosovo in 1389. This is the most decisive battle, arguably, in Muslim European history. If the Muslims won in this battle, essentially it would pave the way for them to reach all the way up to the gates of Vienna. And if they lost, then the Ottomans and Sultan Orhan and Burhan, their ambition of establishing Islam in Europe would be completely quelled. Unfortunately for the Muslims, for the Ottomans, at the Battle of Kosovo, which happened in Kosovo, they defeated the Serb kingdom. And that date, 1389, has been ingrained within the Serb thinking since then. This is the date that they lost and the Muslims won. And you have these ideas now once again, as the Muslims are pushing and advancing through Kosovo and taking everything, steamrolling across the peninsula. They now encounter another problem. You have once again the Crusades, which is an interesting thing because we often think the Crusades are something which happened just in Jerusalem and in the Holy Lands. But actually the Christians, they formed an alliance, the Holy League. And for the next 700 years they would have many attempts at trying to chip away at the Ottoman Islamic influence in Europe. And this was, of course, known as the Crusades. You can class this as a continuation of the Crusades. So the Ottomans really knew that when they wanted to establish rule, they would make sure that they would invest heavily in the infrastructure, in the buildings, in the societies, everything in the Balkans. So actually you have in places in Turkey itself, you have places underdeveloped. I believe like closer to eastern Turkey, you won't see a single Ottoman bridge. But if you go to Bosnia, you'll see, of course, the beautiful Mostar Bridge. Of course, that was bombed, but the Ottomans had built tons of bridges, tons of infrastructure, roads.
Even in Serbia till today.
Even in Serbia.
No, great. I went there myself, but even I know some people that were studying in Bulgaria, in other close European countries that used to regularly visit like Ottoman mosques and like, I don't know, like almost like mini fortresses and the bridges, as you mentioned.
Yeah, exactly. So there's this real, lovely myth that these, anti-Islamic people like to give, is that the Ottomans came to the Balkans and they genocided everybody, they pillaged everything and they stole everything. Of course, to some extent, as the Ottomans, of course, were fierce on the battlefield, without a doubt. Every empire back then worked on conquest, worked on domination in order to survive. Otherwise, simply, nations wouldn't survive. Today, it's a little bit different. We have borders. Everybody knows that's your land, that's our land. But back then, borders shifted and changed. But when it came to civic life, the Ottomans far surpassed any of their counterparts, whether it's the Europeans, whether it's even some of the last remaining dynasties in Muslim dynasties in the Middle East. They far surpassed all of them. And so you have your question was why after 1912, as the Ottomans were kicked out of Europe, 1912 is sort of the beginning of where it really started to go south for the Ottomans in the Balkans. Why did Bosnia remain as this stronghold, as this final stand, this place that still has hundreds of mosques that are hundreds of years old? The answer is, and it's beautiful actually in a way, because the Ottomans invested so much in Sarajevo, the capital city of Bosnia. They prized it as their possession. It became known as the European Jerusalem. All three faiths, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, lived in harmony, relatively, for the most parts of the 500 years that the Ottomans were there, in peace, which is a little bit strange because, Jews aren't native to the Balkan region, or at least there's very, very minimal presence of Jews in the Balkans. And it's actually the Ottomans that brought the Jews to the Balkans after they were persecuted in Spain. So in 1490s, you have the Alhambra decree, where the Christian monarchy completely expels all the Muslims. Either you were killed, you were converted, or you were expelled. And so Muslims and Jews fled from Spain, and the Ottomans said, you know what, we'll allow you to have safe passage in the Balkans. So this community really comes out, and it really, comes into fruition, this harmonious society. Of course, it's not a utopia, without a doubt, but neither was it a dystopia. It far surpassed, like I said, any of Europe at the time.
To get more of an understanding and a background of the Balkan Muslims, I spoke to 2 Balkan Muslims. I found myself 4 a.m. in the morning in Hamburg, sitting on the sofa at my good friend's house, Ayub. Ayub is a Muslim from the Balkans. He's also a political analyst, and in our conversation about my project, he gave me some insights and valuable background information to the region. So I was like, hold on a second, let me get my bag. I grabbed my mic and I turned it on.
We're in Hamburg. It's about, nearly 4 a.m. in the morning. Last night in Hamburg, and we were talking about something. So let's begin the whole thing about the Balkans, like the history, how it started.
I just started to mention that the Balkans played a big role in the Ottoman Empire, right? Many of them, so the Bosnians and the Albanians, worked in high positions, like a vizier, which means nowadays as a general and so on. And from the Balkans, there were also many pashas. Abdul Hamid Rahimahullah also mentioned sometimes the Balkans and says kind of words like the Balkans are the backbone of the Ottoman Empire, together with Kurds and so on. This is one of many reasons why the European and the West doesn't want to have Muslim countries in Europe. So what they did when they saw that the Ottoman Empire is declining by losing wars and so on, it started around about at the 19th century, around about 1850, when the Greeks started the war against the Ottomans, and at 1912, around about this time, the European Houghton Conference in London, where they decided to cut the country. And what they decided was to cut the Muslim countries from Turkey or from the Ottoman Empire back then. So there's a border between, or the countries between the Bosnian, the Albanians, and the rest of the Ummah.
I also sat down in South London with brother Petrit, another good friend of mine who's from the Balkans, who I'll introduce properly a bit later on. He's also a political analyst and he keeps a keen eye on developments in the Balkans. I also asked him about what the future could look like for the Muslims in that region today. But right now, he's here to enrich my understanding more about these white European Muslims.
Because you hail from the Balkans, perhaps you're more acquainted with the history. What is the actual history of Islam when it comes to the Balkans, and particularly the late Ottoman period? Also, when it comes to many people that I spoke to, they said that what was significant about places like Bosnia is that even though there was a period of assimilation, yet they held on to their Muslim identity. So is there something special about these people, perhaps?
So firstly, when it comes to the historical aspects, one of my favorite Ottoman sultans is Mehmet the Conqueror. We all know him as the one who opened Constantinople, based on the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. But he also the one who actually opened the Balkans. It's not a well-known fact. So he obviously opened the Kosovo. In fact, I would not be a Muslim if it wasn't for him. He opened the lands of Kosovo to the Ottoman ideas and Islam in general. Obviously, Mehmet the Conqueror, he opened Belgrade in 1459, then Bosnia in 1463. And since then, these lands have been Muslim lands. Since around, I say, the World War I, they were under the Ottoman control. You know, we're looking at 400 years, 500 years of history, and they were, majority of them converted willfully of their own choice. There's no evidence of any forced conversions and all that, right? The thing is, the issue of why people hold on to it is just the fact it's to do with the strength of the Islamic ideas. This is not something you'll find across anywhere else. You know, if you look at the Eastern Europe, for example, after the fall of communism, they embraced capitalism by droves because they realized there was nothing in communism to actually believe in, right? Whereas in Islam, we have our Aqidah, intellectual Aqidah, we believe in it, we hold on to it dear, and we see a future in it, right? So if anyone comes to us with another idea, we tend to challenge it, right? And we find that there's no truth in it. What we find is that Islam is the only truth, right? And, you know, there has been attempts by Europe to reverse this trend. whether the best through social means, economic means, including Bosnia and Kosovo, for example, by introducing legislation which are contrary to Islamic values, but people have held on to it up till now. And Europe is something they are still struggling in trying to assimilate and reverse this, right? Something they have been, I wouldn't say they have been fully able to do.
And now let's take the conversation back to Ayub just to continue the history.
So, for example, Albania got his independence, but Kosovo was given to Serbia. Some cities or places, important cities like Üsküp, Skopje, was given to Macedonia, and also Montenegro got some small cities, and all of them Orthodox countries around the Albanian place and around the Bosnians started immediately the war against the Muslims. So, for example, Serbia started the war against the Albanians and so on. After that, there was a only short period where the Albanians got united, and this was due the Second World War, bro. After the Second World War and the loss of Nazi Germany, they got again divided. The West powers, I mean, it's not only the West. I think it's were the communists and also the West together. I think both of them had an interest to not have a strong Muslim country on the Balkan.
I'm going to keep interchanging between Ayub and Petrit just to get an understanding of the history, and we'll bring Harris back to continue the conversation. I hope you can bear with the historical context. I know it could be long for some people, but it's very important. And inshallah, we will lead up to the war in the next episode, and you'll get to hear the stories from people, well-known people who went over there from the UK, and you can hear their side and some accounts you would have never heard before. Let's continue.
Kosovo, parts of Albania, North Macedonia, even Bosnia. Europe always looked at them as a thorn on their side because they could not understand how we let these guys slip across, right? There's a thinking in Europe, which is that in 1491, when they removed the Muslims of Spain, and they managed to get rid of the Muslims from Spain after 700-800 years. There's a thinking in Europe, which is that, you know what, hold on, why haven't we done the same to the Muslims of the Balkans? And it's always seen as a remnant of the Ottomans. There are these savages who are not able to manage themselves, rule themselves. We always need to come in, help them out. So the white man's burden, as they call it.
So the protest was like just the Serbs and Croats and so on got united under the communism and Yugoslavia, which was supported from the Soviet Union. They took Kosovo and of course Macedonia, and there was a long period where also the Bosnians and the Albanians from Kosovo has to live under Tito's Yugoslavia, and unfortunately.
So Kosovo was under Yugoslavia, even though it's disconnected by land because Albania is in the middle. So Albania wasn't part of Yugoslavia. It was.
No, it wasn't. Albania was under Enver Hoxha, a strong communist guy who wanted at the first months after the World War II to be united with Yugoslavia. So there was a process.
He wanted to be united with Yugoslavia.
Officially, yes. And there was also a process of it. But at the end, they had different views and so on. And it can be the case that Enver Hoxha just gambled on it and just say that he wanted to be united, but at the end he didn't want it. So Albania went then to a really strict communism, like the Stalin communism, where he closed the borders and lived in a strict isolation. The Kosovo Albanians had no connection to Albania, and it was illegal to cross the border.
So they have an interesting connection with the Bosnian Muslims
Yeah.
because of this situation.
Yeah, but the problem was in the time that the Bosnian and the Kosovo Albanians were influenced by the communism, and both of them got really secular, and the one who were still Muslims or practicing Muslims got in the prison. They had the Bosnian, the Albanians had a short time, in a short period, a better connection when they were fighting for the independency or fighting against the Serbs in round about 1880. On this time roundabout, I'm not sure about the date.
This is before communism entered.
Yeah. It's also before the
The War of the Balkans, basically.
Yes, sure. Yeah. That's right.
After when communism came, they tried to create this whole policy of brotherhood, unity, cohesion.
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct.
Let's go back to the conversation that we're having with Harris about the history.
So that's how Islam kind of came to the region, and also kind of how it remained. How did that then lead us to what happens in 1994? Or maybe like what was happening in the early 90s that led up to 1994 and 1995, like the main years of this whole, people say war, people say genocide. Maybe I'll get your own opinion and view on that. But what leads us up in the more contemporary time?
So we did skip like almost a couple hundred years there. Over time, we can briefly summarize what happened from the Ottoman times. So from the time the Ottomans left to the 1980s, and it's actually really important. So Bosnia, after World War I, was part of this new nation called Yugoslavia. You might have heard of it. Yugoslavia is this collection. It was a kingdom at the time. The Yugoslavia one was a kingdom of Slovenes, Croats, Bosnians, Serbs, some of the South Balkan nations, as we all know. Macedonia was also part of it. And after World War I, of course, the Bosnian Muslims are now integrated into this seemingly non-Muslim environment. But nevertheless, they were able to retain that same, religious tolerance that the Ottomans had during their rule. So Yugoslavia one was almost a continuation of the Ottoman rule, to some extent, in terms of how Muslims were able to practice their deen. Of course, there were restrictions here and there. But after, when the year is 1941, and all of a sudden Europe is engulfed in the flames of the Second World War, and Hitler, the man with the mustache, he decides to do one of the biggest military operations in history. And this is Operation Barbarossa. He decides, once he's invaded France in the Second World War, and he's even looking towards Britain, he's like, hang on, I'm going to do something, I'm going to pull out a card, and I'm going to invade the entirety of Eastern Europe. So he invades Soviet Union, and he also invades Yugoslavia. This is a nation where Bosnia is part of. And
at this time, is Yugoslavia with the USSR, or is it independent? Or
yeah, so during this time, Yugoslavia was a kingdom. It had its own monarchy, and it was actually a little bit separated from the rest of Eastern Europe, so Poland and the Soviet Union. So it was its own autonomous region that had governed relatively in harmony. And it was with the introduction of the German occupation forces in the Balkans, in Yugoslavia, which triggered you could say, arguably the first Bosnian War. So we assume that there's only been one Bosnian War. But in fact, since the end of the Ottomans, there has been many, many attempts from the Serbs and from those that surround Bosnia to erase Islam from Europe. So just from the withdrawal of the Ottomans from about 1800s to the 1900s, you have 5 million Muslims killed, 5 million Muslims expelled from Ottoman Muslim Europe. And so there's always been this attempt to eradicate the Muslims. Even though the Bosnians, they are actually Slavic people. They are indigenous to the land. In fact, before the Ottomans arrived, before Islam arrived to Bosnia, the Bosnians had their own church. It was different to the church of the Croats. It was different to the church of the Serbs, because they were oppressed by the Orthodox, and they were also oppressed by the Catholics. So they had their own church, and it originated from a movement called the Bogomils. And the Bogomils are a very, very interesting sect of Christianity, because they believed in one God to some extent. The Bosnian church, they would pray 5 times a day. they would actually face almost the direction of Mecca. They would have their niches within their churches that would face the Qibla. And they were very monotheistic compared to the rest of Europe. And so that is one of the reasons why the people there were so readily accepting of Islam, of this religion. And it's almost as if Allah had made them like this, so that when Islam originally came to Europe in the 1300s, they were readily accepting it because obviously it was more appealing than the rivalries between Catholicism and Orthodoxy. And it was something that they were used to, this idea of praying. And they would pray the same way we would pray. The sajda, for example, almost identical in some regards. So that is one of the reasons why the surrounding regions like Bulgaria, they had a huge population exchange and a huge exodus of Muslims. But the Bosnian Muslims remained and they stayed there. And is arguably the reason why they're called the last stronghold of Europe, because they stood their ground and they fought. But it was until the Germans invaded in 1941 where that whole region, Yugoslavia, begins to erupt in a very, very violent civil war. So up until this point, you've had attempts to eradicate the Bosniaks from Bosnia and just the entire region as well. You have many Bosniaks, these are Muslim Bosnians, that are trapped in other nations today. For example, in Serbia and Montenegro, there's actually a region, a large region, that was once historically part of Bosnia, that was chipped away and taken off the Ottomans, and obviously they're trapped now in other nations. So World War II comes about, and you have three main factions, and this is really important to understand the Yugoslav wars in the 1990s. So the first faction were the Chetniks. These are Serb ultranationalists, and if there's anything to know about Serb ultranationalists, they are Orthodox Christians.
That doesn't sound good.
It doesn't sound good, absolutely. Nationalism in the Balkans is a terrible thing. It has really plagued the region for hundreds of years. So it's important to note, number one, our first, you could say, adversaries are Serb nationalists and the Orthodox. The next sort of contender in Yugoslavia were the Croats. These, during World War II, were fascist aligned, and they were called the Ustasha. So it's important that they're also Catholic. So you have this rivalry always between the Serbs and the Croats. Bear in mind, like I said, this is quantum Balkan theory. This is a lot to wrap your head around. So maybe if I say this, it probably won't make sense.
I think this part would just be an episode in and of itself.
literally, because it's even just what I've mentioned, I've condensed so much. So
that's what we like in the world of media. We like
condensed and short to the point.
We don't like the books, we like the movies.
That's it. Amazing. So the Serbs and the Croats were at loggerheads with one another, even since the Ottomans were there, before the Ottomans. So in World War II, the Serb Chetniks fight against the Croatians, and the Croatians literally round up, I think it's almost 1 million Serbs in concentration camps, because obviously the Croatians were aligned with Germany. So they got benefits, and they actually got to take the entirety of Bosnia. And the Bosnian Muslims found themselves in the middle of all of this, and they were actually caught in the crossfire. And approximately 100,000 Muslims, just in World War II alone, were genocided in this manner. And you got to remember, like, the population isn't big. Bosnia is a small place. So the population is really small, and to have 100,000 men, women and children brutally massacred, that literally every bridge in Bosnia, the Serb Chetniks, most of these crimes were committed by the Serbs, by the way, against the Muslims were the Serbs, because they had this idea, once again, going back to the date.
So this is during World War II in the during the civil wars.
Yeah, exactly. So from 1941 to 1945. So as World War II is happening across the whole world, the Balkans is also like a hotspot, a violent hotspot. So they say, like, every bridge in Bosnia, the Serbs would round up the Muslims and they would slit their throats and trick them off. So they say that the river Drina, which runs through Bosnia, is the largest mass grave of Muslims in Europe, because you have thousands of, you don't even know how many. Still today, we're finding bodies from World War II that we're still finding just dumped up in the river. And the Serbs, the reason why they did this, what do you think? What would be the reason why the Serbs wanted to kill these Muslims? And it goes back in history.
It's probably like a reclaim of our religion, of our land. Basically, just to get rid of the Muslims, isn't it? Ethnic cleansing, exactly what they're doing today in Palestine, I guess.
Absolutely. And it also has it links back to 1389, that same date I told you, so where
we're going to come back. It's like this is our comeback.
That's it. So after 700 years, they still treat 1389 as if it was yesterday. So they have this idea that these Bosnian Muslims, although they're indigenous to Bosnia, they're Turks. So during the entirety of the 1900s, even in the 1990s, the Bosnians were never classed as Bosniaks, they were classed as Turks, remnants of the quote unquote, occupation of Bosnia. Even though the Serbs themselves actually helped and assisted the Ottomans in their occupations. So they have this idea that we're removing Turks. So throughout the entirety of the 1940s, you have this genocide against the Bosniaks.
Would you say from 1945 onwards, it was relatively peaceful, or until we get to the 90s?
So, and thus we enter the next chapter after 1945. So, Yugoslavia is brought back together again. So the nations of Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, for example, those are the three main ones. They're brought back together, even though they'd just literally been at each other's necks for the past couple of years. They're brought back, but this time they're brought under a new regime. Do you know what that is?
I can assume a communist.
Yeah, communism. So communism after World War II is super popular because everybody's broke. They need money. They need a way to vent out, and they seek that through communism. And so communism became the state ideology. So Yugoslavia is now known as the Communist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Long term, just for the nation is now governed by socialist ideas. So it was relatively peaceful. The man who had brought Yugoslavia together was called Tito. He was a fighter during the Second World War who liberated, quote unquote, liberated Yugoslavia as a communist himself.
And whose ethnicity did he hail from?
It's interesting because everybody argues he's from their ethnicity. So some Bosnians say he's Bosnian, some Croats say he's Croat, some Serbs say he's Serb. But probably he was Croat, right? That's what they say. But he had an idea, and it was called brotherhood and unity. Because the Muslims and the Serbs and the Catholics were just killing each other for the past 4 years, they wanted to have an idea of no nationalism whatsoever. Any attempt of saying you're a Serb or, boastfully, being patriotic, you were simply sidelined, you were arrested, and sometimes even executed. Because obviously, in order for Yugoslavia and the Balkans to work, you have to have some sort of cohesion. If you let everybody go loose with their fascism and nationalism, you're just going to have more genocide. So he actually encouraged Muslims to marry into non-Muslim families, Serbs to marry into Croat families.
Things are adding up now.
Exactly. So you have now a culture of, suppressing the Bosniak identity. So although there was not necessarily, there wasn't any killings, there wasn't any massacres, you did have a few imprisonments of ulama and also influential people like the first president of Bosnia. He wrote a lot of works on Islam, and he tried to revive the spirit of Islam during communism, during the 50s and 60s and 80s, and he was imprisoned.
I can guess under communist rule there was a suppression of religion, most definitely.
Absolutely. It wasn't as worse as we saw, for example, in the Soviet Union or even Albania. Albania wasn't part of Yugoslavia, it was its own communism. And in fact, Albania was classed as like the first atheistic country in Europe, which is concerning because it's a nation that was heavily influenced by Muslims, and it was almost majority Muslim.
I've always had this question, which I've asked many of my guests about Balkan Muslims. So I decided to ask this particular question to Petrit, who's a Balkan Muslim himself. The question's about to come up. You'll hear it in a second, but let's see what he had to say about it.
I've had to hear this idea or this personal experience from many people who have been to the Balkans, specifically when it comes to Bosnia, as that's the subject I'm covering. And they say that a lot of the Muslims, they were Muslim by name, they kept their Islamic identity from that perspective, but they weren't the most practicing of people, or they had like an Islamic awakening during the war, but prior to that, they would intermarry. You couldn't tell the difference between a Muslim and a non-Muslim. Why do you think that view is there when it comes to Muslims from the Balkans? I mean, it's definitely a stereotype, you could argue. Maybe there's some truth to it, but maybe what's the reasons behind that?
I think there's some truth to that. I think we should not shy away from the fact that Kosovo, Albania, or the Balkans in general. I think one is there is the historical aspect, which were the Ottomans, when they were in these lands, they did not really pay much attention to the sort of ideological, intellectual upbringing of society. They needed really two things. They needed men to fight wars. They needed money and land, right? So there is the historical aspect. And then the second one is that they have struggled for the past 100 years when this region was under the different ethnicities ruled by the Serbs or ruled by the communism in general. There was a suppression. You know that people have held on to it is because when they do have the chance, they will vote for Islam, right? And to give an example is that recently Europe tried to pass a same-sex law in Kosovo, but it failed through the parliamentary means. They will try it again, by trying and bribing the MPs, offering them money and so on. But the people as a whole, they hold on to the Islamic values, even if it's a very superficial, it's very basic. But the thing is that you have to remember is that there's hope in this, there's goodness in this, right? Because what I find is by traveling back home is that when you offer them a valid alternative and you explain to them how the vision will look like in terms of how Islam is going to improve your economic, political, social situation and aspects, people actually, you see them, their face lighten up, right? So there's goodness in the people, even as it's shallow and is basic. You'll find that these same people are going to support Islam when he eventually returns, inshallah, right? So they are secular, but there's also hope for the future in the same people.
The problem here was that everything in Yugoslavia was built up in a personality cult about Tito. And Tito was the dictator of Yugoslavia. And when he died, there were many nationalist movements which were also supported by the West. In 1990, 1991, this time about, the first country who declared his independence was Slovenia, which had really close connection to the West and had a big war. The biggest war was between the Bosnians and the Serbs and the Croatians.
So this is while it's still Yugoslavia.
It's officially still Yugoslavia, and Bosnia and also Croatia started or called his independence out. Interesting fact is, before Bosnia called his or declared his independence, the European states tried to make peace, and they had a conference about the peace. In this conference, I think they were talking about to give some Bosnian lands to the Serbs, but Bosnia, or especially Alija Izetbegovic, who was the president at this time of the Bosnians, refused this agreement. And there's a famous, I think, Italian diplomat who says, after the refusal, diplomat says, there is a power behind this refusal, and I think, or it was clear that at this time the only power or the only state who has the power was the States, United States. It might be the case that the United States pushed Alija Izetbegovic to say no to the agreement. Why? Because it was clearly under the interest of the states to divide and split up Yugoslavia. So when the war was, Bosnia had lost nearly or more about 100,000 people, bro.
During the whole Bosnian War?
Yes.
We're talking about in the 90s?
Yeah. They had the biggest loss in the war as a country. Matter of fact, they now have a country with a system which doesn't work because the power in this country is by a German guy, bro.
Explain that.
So you have in Bosnia three different ethnicity, right? And since there are big problems and they can't communicate or work together, they installed a position to make decisions easier. And this position is nowadays held by a German. So the German can decide about law and so on. So that's a crazy system, which which shows us that Bosnia is a kind of a failed state, bro. They can't make reforms regarding their structure and so on.
So a non-Muslim German
Yes.
is basically
It's the president basically. He has the power, bro, and it's official. It's not. It's not a conspiracy or something like that. It's official, and there are also nowadays some Serb movements which are seeking independency from Bosnia.
The European Union is an economic union. It's not a political union per se, right? That's why each country has their own borders, have their own nationalities, ethnicities, and so on. They have problems with Catalonia. They have problems with Brexit, right? And they also have a problem with the region in the Balkans, which is that if you to compare contrast with the 400, 500 years of the Ottoman history, where quite frankly it was the most peaceful time that the Balkans had, and even the non-Westerners, academics, they'll point to this phenomena. What Europe has done with Bosnia specifically is that they separate it into two parts. So when you look at Bosnia, it's 51% Bosnia and 49% is Republika Srpska, which is a Serb part, right? So what Europe has done is that they have not resolved the Serbian problem. They just kick the can down the road. And at the moment, it's the political system is very complex. So you have, for example, the High Office of European Representation. You have a single person who he's unaccountable. He comes from Europe, Christian Schmidt. He is able to kick out politicians in Bosnia. He's able to reverse Supreme Court rulings. He's able to annul parliamentary rulings. He can make any decisions he wants in Bosnia, or frankly. And the point of this is he does all of these not to find solutions for Bosnia, but to keep it separate, right? Because they do not have the ability to permanently find solutions for these multi-ethnic societies. All they do is to make sure that they are separated and they're always in need of Europe to come in and help them out, basically. So we should bear this in mind, which is Europe does not have the ability to bring together ethnicities in a coherent and cohesive manner, basically.
So I think we're touching on how communism affected the Muslims, and we mentioned how mosques, of course, were still there, but you had this clandestine silencing and suppressing of this Muslim identity. Bear in mind, Yugoslavia has 20%, I believe 20% of the entire population were Muslims. So you have Bosnia, for example, and also Kosovo. Kosovo is a Muslim nation, and that was part of Yugoslavia. So there are a lot of Muslims in Yugoslavia during communism that had to suppress their faith. And I was speaking on the ground with a couple of these older people. Like literally most of the old people you see survived and lived through communism. And they would say that we passed on our iman. Had it not been for our elders, had it not been for us, this is them speaking, Islam would have been completely erased. Had we not passed it down to our children in a very secretive manner, Islam in this region would have been completely erased, as was seen in Albania. Like if you go there today, bro, you can't even find halal meat. You have to literally scour to find halal meat in a Muslim country. So alhamdulillah, Bosnia was able to relatively escape that sort of secularism, but also you can still see the lingering effects of communism today. You'll see people not as practicing as you'd expect. You can argue, hang on, why are these not wearing hijab? Why have they not got a beard? It's easy for us to judge, but after 45 years of strict, ardent communism, obviously it's going to have an impact.
And that's it for part 1. The next episode, inshallah, will continue to lead up to the war, and then we'll begin the accounts of people and their stories. This isn't necessarily going to be chronological. It's going to be episodes of people telling their story from the beginning of the war till the end of the war. And I must warn you that some of the stuff is quite disturbing, it's quite graphic throughout the whole series. But stay tuned for the next episode, inshallah, and I'll see you in part 2.